Welcome back to Women's Business Voice. I'm your host, Angela De Souza, and we are featuring a fantastic series called From Side Hustles to Empires, Histories of Working Women's Lives. And this is featuring a series of conversations between Dr. Amy Edwards and a range of historians. The series as a whole will explore the relationship between gender, work, and career in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, asking what's new and what isn't about the nature of working women's lives in Britain. Episodes were focused on different industries, from politics and science to entertainment, sex advice, sales, and beyond, through the lives of some of the women who worked in them. The series explores not only the success stories of famous entrepreneurs and business leaders, but also hidden histories of women who made a living in systems and structures not often designed with them in mind. This episode is entitled At Home with Avon, The Rise and Rise of Direct Sales with Dr. Amy Edwards from the University of Bristol. And we are flipping the tables today, and she's going to be interviewed by Dr. Sarah Jones. So over to you, Sarah.
All right, welcome everybody, and welcome to this episode that looks at the direct sales industry from the vantage point of the women who helped it boom. My name's Sarah Jones. You might have noticed I am subbing in today as host because our guest is none other than my good friend and colleague and your usual host, Dr. Amy Edwards, who's going to be talking to us about what it meant to kind of be a doorstep saleswoman in the 20th century. Amy, I would say, is a very good friend and colleague of mine at the University of Bristol, researches histories of capitalism, finance, and enterprise. Her exceptional, she would never say it, but her exceptional book, Are We Rich Yet? The Rise of Mass Investment Culture in Contemporary Britain, available at all good booksellers, explores a history of financial reform in Britain through the culture that surrounded financial markets. She's not going to like me for that one, but it really is very good. So go check it out. Her current project, The Secret of My Success, if I've got that right, is going great guns and looks at the rise of enterprise culture in Britain and the lives of self-employed women since the 1950s, which I hope we'll hear a little bit more about today. So Amy, we've turned the tables. You spent the first couple of episodes here as co-hosts, asking other people, grilling other people about their research. So now it's your turn in the hot seat, I suppose. So actually, you could tell us a little bit. I'm sure your listeners are, very keen to hear a little bit more about you and the research you're doing. So, what are your kind of key interests at the moment? And actually, how did you get here? How did you come to, study self-employed women?
Before I start, what an introduction. Thank you very much, Rome. And B, I'm sweating slightly, having, as you say, been hosting and just being in the wonderful, fun position of just getting to ask some questions and now having to say some stuff. But yeah, so as you say, I'm a historian who, actually, unlike a lot of the people who are on the different episodes, I'm not a gender historian by training. My background is more in histories of the political economy, of business and finance. So that's kind of how I came to this interest in the working lives of women. And to be honest, it probably goes slightly even further back than that. I've always been interested in political marketing and how politicians translate really complex ideas into campaigns that will win people's votes. And so I was kind of always interested in that. And one of the masters of that in context of like British history is Margaret Thatcher. Her and the Conservative Party in the 1980s, like that was one of their really big strengths. So I guess like for a time, like I was just interested. I wanted to know how the Conservative Party uh, sold its particular political ideology in the 1980s. And the ways that all started was I just became interested in the political marketing around privatization when they sold off loads of state-owned companies and looking at all the adverts around that. And basically, since then, I've just become fascinated by how quote unquote ordinary people understand and experience large scale changes in the economy. So whether that's at a political level, at a personal level, in terms of their day-to-day lives, in terms of what they think about the economy and the role it plays in their lives. So yeah, you very kindly mentioned my book, but that was mainly about investment culture and the ways that people in the past and kind of coming up to the present, come to understand what the stock market is, what stocks and shares are, what role it plays in society, and what role it might play in their everyday life. But rather than kind of looking at that in terms of high politics, I was like interested in, I don't know, films like Wall Street and financial board games and stuff like that. But anyway, this is a very long way round of coming to my current project, which is I wanted to do something similar, but instead of understanding how everyone got the shareholding bug, instead I wanted to understand where the dream of working for yourself came from. By the late 20th century and today, there's like, there's like hustle culture and this idea that working for yourself and being free of a boss is kind of at least is a good way to work, or is something that people would want to aim for. We have The Apprentice on TV, which is all about becoming an entrepreneur, and I wanted to kind of understand the history of that, where this kind of dream of being self-employed comes from, and if in fact it was a dream, if it always has been, or what, and then what life was like for people who did become self-employed. I should also say both my parents worked for themselves, so some of this is just the usual stuff that lots of historians have, which is weirdly using the past to try and figure out something about their own lives, and their own experiences. But yeah, I had to start somewhere. So I thought, what better group to start with than the experiences of self-employed women who have often been overlooked, especially like women who work part-time or women working in jobs that weren't like quote unquote professions or careers. Um, the kind of people who just don't often appear in historical narratives about work, about the big changes that happened in the economy. So yeah, that's kind of where I came to.
And I know as part of that, we've spoken a little bit about sort of direct sales, Avon ladies, right? And Tupperware
Yeah.
parties. And I know you're really kind of interested in that. So could you tell us a bit more about that? We've all sort of heard of them, but not necessarily might not know much about their history. So could you tell us a bit about that industry and its history in Britain?
Yeah, so like I'm interested in all sorts of different kinds of self-employment, but one of the groups that I became really interested in are people who are like technically and legally self-employed, but also seemingly have relationships with much larger companies. So direct sales agents is one of them, and we can talk maybe a bit about this later. But they are people who are very purposefully not employees of a company, but they come on as independent sales contractors or independent sales reps. That's why we call them sales reps in that, sales representatives. Um, but yeah, and so direct sales itself is actually a bit of a catch-all term that describes a whole range of distribution strategies. It includes practices like door-to-door sales, mail order catalogs, home party plans, your kind of classic Tupperware setup, or Ann Summers party or body shop party, that kind of situation. Multi-level marketing, single-level marketing, pyramid schemes at various times. All of these slightly different ways of organizing labor and people's work have come under this bracket of direct sales, but it essentially refers to things where products are sold directly, hence the name, from manufacturers straight to customers. So kind of skipping out wholesalers, skipping out retailers, the people who make the products get them straight to the people who want to buy the products. Um, and direct sales, I guess, in the formalized in the way that we would think about it today as like a big formal industry in which there are really large companies like Avon, that emerged in the kind of early 20th century in America, and then it kind of came via America often to Britain. So a lot of the first big direct sales companies in Britain were American outfits or were American entrepreneurs who had experienced or seen the success of direct sales in the US and decided to set up something similar in the UK. And that kind of really came after the Second World War. But the kinds of selling practices that it relied upon actually were quite well embedded, and were not new in the post-war period. So like door-to-door sales has roots in like the 19th and early 20th century. Often the types of sales practices used by quite marginalized groups in society who are kind of excluded from labor markets in different ways. There's like long histories of commercial travelers, like what would have been called rag and bone men, black market kind of perfume sellers, or something called toffee men, which were often seamen who had kind of worked on ships that had docked in the UK, in Britain, and then they kind of decided to stay in the UK for a bit, and they would make toffee and then go around the streets and kind of well, sell sweets and things that they had made. So there's all of these kind of practices are in place. It's not unusual for people, the idea that someone come knocking on their door, but there are some quite big changes after World War II that change how people respond to and think about that. So like I say, one, it becomes quite formalized, and becomes attached to much bigger companies. And the other is that it becomes feminized, in like in ways that maybe we can talk about in a bit. But in terms of Britain and the experiences of women working for these kind of companies, the two big companies that are worth talking about is Avon and Tupperware. So both are American companies, have origins over there. Avon started life as a California perfume company, actually in the late 1800s. It was founded by a door-to-door salesman. It kind of evolved over time, and became known for having predominantly women reps. That was quite like progressive. But it's in the 1950s that eventually Avon decided to set up a UK subsidiary and start to kind of function in the UK. Tupperware follows not long after. Again, has an earlier history set up by a guy called Earl Tupper, hence the Tupperware. But yeah, and it has a bit of a slow start, and initially there's quite a lot of people aren't sure about it. You see lots of stuff in the press about people being like, this is like this gross American practice, it's really uncouth, it's not becoming, certainly of these sales tactics are, they're not very British. And they're certainly not something that we want our like lovely, quiet, retiring British housewives to be doing, going and knocking on doors and yeah, there's just quite a bit of a reaction to it, to be honest. But over time, it becomes like embedded. Those companies are hugely successful. And by the time you get to the 1970s, there are a whole load of other companies that are being founded doing similar stuff. There's one called Oriflame. It's a Swedish company, but comes to the UK. Pippa D. There's companies like Clean Easy that you might have heard of. They kind of transition into direct sales, having not always done that, having more like paid salespeople, but then transitioning to these kind of independent sales contractors. And then by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, it's really taking off. Yeah, so that's kind of a very potted history of the direct sales industry in the UK.
You talked a bit in there about that's actually quite interesting sort of gender balance here, because you talked in there actually about some men being involved, especially in early direct sales, but then this kind of process of feminization. So in the period that you're working on, are we seeing this as something that only women are doing? Is it only women who are direct sales agents?
Um, no. And in fact, in the sources there are kind of fun little stories about like, oh, there's the term Avon lady comes to capture like the direct sales rep for Avon, but there's all sorts of newspaper stories which are like Avon laddie or Avon boy. But the kind of fun of it all is like, oh, isn't this weird and rare because there's a man doing this job that's meant to that we associate with women doing. I guess the main thing that happens is that direct selling, as I say, is not, and door-to-door selling is not new, is definitely something that is done kind of before the likes of Avon and Tupperware. And in the early 20th century in Britain, it's much more coded as masculine. There are some industries for which it stays very kind of male dominated, so like the insurance, like door-to-door insurance sales, things like that. But in those kind of manifestations, it's often, not always, but it is often like employed sales representatives who also maybe get a commission. And it's not only that, but it's more likely that it is employees. One of the big things is that becomes this system where it's not employed people, but independent contractors. But yeah, it goes through this kind of huge process of feminization. And that happens for a couple of different reasons. So in the early 20th century, you just see a lot more the kind of feminization of like retail in general. There's the rise of the idea of the shop girl, of women working behind the counter in a shop. You're much more likely to encounter women in sales, in like formal sales in retail. But yeah, then as you go through the 20th century, this idea of door-to-door selling, companies basically realize that if they want to sell women's products to women, that the best thing that they can do is to get women to do that and to try and access women's social networks as well. and that they're going to have much more luck. And in some ways, it's seen as like less controversial to allow a woman into your home to talk about buying perfumes than to allow a strange man into your home. So yeah, it becomes much more associated with women. And this also kind of goes along with like one of the big historical trends that I know other people have mentioned in other episodes, which is that more and more women are working, especially after World War II. Not that women didn't work before that, but there is a growing norm of dual income families, the need for a second income, or the desire for one in a kind of mass consumer society where there's like way more opportunities, it seems, to buy things and to have luxuries. Families want that little bit of extra money that a second part-time wage might provide in order to get those, like to have a family holiday or to buy a washing machine or whatever. So yeah, you see like a huge growth in the number of women in the labor force, but they are often doing kind of part-time work. And so alongside all of these trends, I think it's like by the 1970s, there's a organization called the Direct Sales Association, and they estimate that over 90% of self-employed sales contractors that are selling direct to the home are women. So yeah, hugely kind of dominated by women by that point.
And what's it like to be a direct sales agent? What do we know about the experiences of, say, the Avon lady or someone running a Tupperware party? What did the work actually look like for them?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I guess there's kind of two ways of answering it. One is from the perspective of the companies, and one is from the perspective of the women doing it. So I'll start with the first. So for the companies that are acting as direct sales companies, there's like the appeal of the model that they set up are like fairly self-evident. So as I said, the people who are doing this work are not employees. They don't have, as a result, they like don't have any obligation to sell. They're not like contracted. They don't get a wage. Um, they often pay for a startup pack of like materials, and they will be like overseen by a regional manager who will encourage them and invite them along to meetings and offer them like optional training and stuff. But they don't have that traditional like employee relationship, which for companies means that they don't have to pay all the usual things that you have to pay around an employee, like um, national insurance contributions or pensions, or you don't have to worry about firing people. There's a quote from a former chairman of the Direct Selling Association, a guy called Richard Berry, who basically put it that companies put, quote, virtually no financial investment in participants. Like, this is not a big risk for them to take on these people. It's still quite a lot of work because they constantly have to recruit people because people fade in and out of it. But yeah, and it means that the companies, because they're direct selling, they also don't need to pay for shop fronts or anything like that. They don't need a shop because the selling is happening in people's homes, on the playground, after school, whatever. And it also means that they get to access women's social networks. The way that the selling works is like women selling to their friends, to their families, to friends of friends, things like that. So they get this kind of like marketing and reach that they otherwise wouldn't be able to have. For women, the thing that they're kind of seemingly getting in return is a solution to one of the big challenges of the mid 20th century for women working, um, which is the balance between their responsibilities and their continued assumed responsibilities at home, so domestic care, domestic work, unpaid labour at home, and that their role is there and that they are still expected to look after children, but with this growing expectation or ambition that they might also like to go out and work. So direct sales is inherently flexible. Again, you don't have like contracted work hours, so you can work around the schedules and needs of your family unit. A lot of women kind of pick it up as work because it's kind of quote unquote low skilled. The amount of money or training or experience that you need is very minimal, which is something that the companies make very clear that you don't need experience in sales. You just need enough money, which is a very small amount to buy the startup pack. So it seems like it kind of offers a useful fix. Sometimes short-term fix for like redundancy or unemployment, or for women trying to get back into the job market after having had children and maybe not having that same level of experience to apply for other kinds of jobs. It basically offers women a kind of a bridge in gaps of time and gaps of finance, in employment gaps, in a scenario where the economy is very gendered and that women have far fewer opportunities for well-paid full-time work Um, and again, in a kind of a gendered economy where they are expected to perform the vast majority of care work.
As a sort of professional nerd, I'm always interested in, it's actually really difficult as a historian to kind of get at this kind of everyday life that you're talking about, especially for women. I think it's probably fair to say that sometimes women's history can be quite tricky because the archive that they often leave behind has not been as robust as some other sort of areas. So how easy have you found it to learn about these women and what their lives were like? What kind of sources do you find yourself working with to try and kind of get at this kind of life, this kind of work?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think, I mean, in some ways, the kind of picture I've been painting, sorry, is necessarily a bit generalized, because one of the difficulties is this is a very contingent labor force, and women come in and out of this work. For lots of other industries, there has been enough academic interest, or the industries are like well established in professions, and people kind of have like different kinds of contracts and kind of, like teaching or nursing. There are studies of these groups, and you can find out not totally easily, but like fairly easily, like how many people were employed in different professions. But as I say, this is a much more like ad hoc, slightly contingent workforce where companies like Avon, I suspect probably at certain times didn't even really, they would know technically how many people were on their books, I'm sure, but having a clear sense of how many of those people were actually active. Women often spoke about just kind of fading out because they weren't contracted, they just sort of stopped. And so there wasn't this like endpoint of like a termination of contract. So yeah, it's a real challenge to build like a very concrete picture at a large scale. Some of these companies do have archives. So some of the stuff I've used is Avon, the company, has an archive with all their business archives. Because they're an American company, there's much more information about the American side of the business, but there are still bits about their functioning when they set up in the UK. And in particular, they have all the packs that they used to send reps. Um, so they would send out these kind of 3 weekly packs for every campaign that they did. And it was like sales advice literature, or the order forms, all the bits and pieces. So you can kind of read between the lines sometimes of based on what the company is saying to people and the kind of like memos they're sending out, which would be like, please make sure that you like do send your order slips in on time. It's nearly Christmas and like these really need to come in and we're working with this way. And like you can start to read between that of like, oh, then it must have been this, like people must have been experiencing this, or they're responding clearly to a problem that lots of people are telling them they're having with X or Y. They also have like interviews with reps where they talk about their life or their sales tip or what works for them. And again, like those quotes are obviously chosen by the company, but you can still kind of read interesting things from that. There are also like quite a lot of newspaper coverage. And then the one thing that I've done for this project, which I've personally not done before, but there's loads of excellent historians who do oral histories, is to interview people. So I've been interviewing people who, at various points in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, some of them are Avon ladies or have worked for different direct sales companies, but some of them also do different kind of jobs. But yeah, it's really interesting, but a bit of a challenge, as you say.
Mm. Do we have any? Because let's say lots of people had almost what sounds like quite modest ambitions in terms of bringing in some extra money for the family. But are there stories of women who maybe took it a bit further than that? How much scope did it give them to be that kind of, I suppose, entrepreneur or to work their way up?
Yeah, I think again quite mixed. There are definitely some of the people I interviewed, they ended up staying with a particular company for a long time, worked their way through to like a local manager and then maybe even a regional manager, so that it was possible to kind of work your way up through. This changes over time, but it is worth saying, I suppose, that at some companies, so like Avon for a long time, um, it was still very common that the very highest levels, so the like senior management of the company, that was all men, that there was a kind of ceiling past which women did not really pass, which is interesting for a company which in some ways is sort of stood as like a stands as a like, we hire women, like this is quite progressive. So yeah, that's always a bit complicated and interesting. But there are other examples which look slightly different as well. The most famous one is Tupperware, which, as I said, the company was founded by a guy called Earl Tupper. He worked, I think, as a subcontractor, or like he was involved in a big American company called DuPont, who they do like chemicals and stuff. But he was involved in like plastic production during World War II, and he basically got the idea of like, I reckon some of this stuff, there could be like a mass retail market for some of the materials I'm working with. If they were turned into something different, we might be able to sell something here. And he was right. So that was where kind of Tupperware, the plastic tubs, came from. He realized that the like durable hardware, heat resistant nature of the plastic was going to be a good fit for that. But in some ways, the company, like it did all right. It was fine. It was selling stuff, but it wasn't like the big success story that we think of it as having been now. It was kind of like muddling along. And essentially, he came across this woman who had been called Brownie Wise. She was a divorced woman, which is worth saying just because we're talking about the 1940s, 1950s here, when that was slightly more unusual, and kind of set her apart in terms of cultural expectations of women anyway at that time. Not totally, but it became a big part of her own story actually for herself, is that she was divorced and therefore she wanted to make it on her own and all of this. But so she started as a sales rep selling products for a company called Stanley Products, at kind of home parties where at that time you would have a professional salesperson who would go in and do a party and sell some stuff. And she was selling products, including Tupperware, and she thought this stuff is great for like product demonstrations. I think there were stories of her like she realized you could lob it at a wall and it wouldn't crack, that you could do these quite like visual. She was basically a fantastic saleswoman. And so yeah, she got pulled in to Tupperware. They realized this and they made her very quickly made her its like president of marketing, and she became the face of Tupperware. The company grew and grew. She set up this kind of slightly new model where instead of salespeople, it was going to be regular housewives were going to run the parties and do the parties. She's kind of set up like many of the like the corporate structure that allowed women to like move through different levels if they sold enough, that they kind of moved up the hierarchy. So a lot of the things we associate with home party selling and how that works was kind of at least popularized and like further developed by Brownie Wise. And she also became this kind of like cult superhero figure in the industry. She kind of combined a lot of like religious belief, but with also belief in like friendship and love and aspiration and self-belief. She really wanted to like work on women's belief in themselves, and kind of spoke to this idea of the American dream. And they used to have these like amazing training events where they would have these like week-long festivals at the headquarters, where they would get women to come in and do all the training, and they would have these like bizarre things going on. So they had like a dig for gold theme one year where they like buried stuff all around the estate and women would go out and hunt, and like they would find like mini Cadillacs which represented a real Cadillac. So yeah, they dug for gold. She herself was like a kind of queen of self-promotion. She wrote an autobiography, she wrote self-help books, or kind of she did motivational books, things like that. So she becomes this like interesting figurehead, certainly. And that she sort of believes in promoting women. I wouldn't go so far as to call her a feminist. She's working in a very different way to other ideas that were coming out in that kind of 50s, going into the 60s kind of period. Hers is a much more individualistic, kind of business focused, self-belief, positive thinking kind of version of women's liberation. But nonetheless, she's kind of very interested in like women and women at work. But yeah, she actually eventually gets squeezed out of the company in the 1950s because she has a falling out with Earl Tupper. And then she goes on to some different business ventures. But yeah, she's probably the most famous. But there are other ones like Ann Summers. Ann Summers is very much at the forefront of that company, which again is a kind of sex toy but direct sales. home party style outfit. Not only that, they also have shops and things as well, but they do some of that direct sales model or home party model. Anita Roddick, who oversees Body Shop. So yeah, there are some folks.
Mm. And where are we now? Like, is direct sales as big now as it was then? What do things look like today?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the things that I have really come to think, having done this project, is that a lot of the things that we associate with work today as being like, whether that's like the gig economy, the rise of home working, of the rise of like subcontracted labor, the rise of flexible hours, things like that, we tend to think of them as like a 21st century phenomenon, and even sometimes like a post-COVID phenomenon. But in some ways, and I guess this has been a bit of a theme of many of the episodes, is there's continuity and there's change. That's kind of the great story of being a historian, is some stuff looks different, some stuff looks the same. It's more complicated than that, but um, but yeah, is that actually many of the working conditions that we associate with like the mainstream economy today were actually the working conditions for a long time for lots and lots of women. So these groups of women in particular, they were working in kind of subcontracted, um, quite precarious employment that was often part-time, and where they were often excluded from labor markets. Like normally we think of the mid-20th century as like the height of wage labor, steady careers, big industries, industrialization, people have a job for life. And that was true for some people, but there were lots of people who were not easily kind of bought into that system or kind of accommodated by it. So yeah, I guess in terms of where we are today, direct sales industry itself has like changed in lots of different ways. Obviously, the idea of like door-to-door knocking has died a death with the rise of the internet, and but I guess it's not a million miles away from some of the stuff that like influencers do. But yeah, I guess so. That's one thing, is that like these working conditions are maybe not as new as we think. And I guess the other one that really kind of speaks to some of the things that we experience today is this idea of flexibility. So for a lot of women, the key here for them was that this kind of work allowed them to work flexibly in ways, allowed them to have a job while still doing the things that were expected of them, which was childcare and things like that. But that flexibility is a double-edged sword, because then it increases or continues the expectation that you are working around those things. So yes, it allows you to go and have a job, but it doesn't fundamentally undermine the idea that a woman's place is at home, or that the large amount, like the vast majority of care work, should be theirs. And I guess I mentioned COVID a minute ago, but a lot of the research that came out of like COVID is that when everyone started home working, that it was women who ended up doing that. When people's hours were flexible and they were working from home, that it would often fell again to women to do more of the childcare. And it was their work that tended to get more interrupted or disrupted in different ways. So yeah, as I say, it seems like the running theme is things change, but lots of things stay the same, and that there is a very deeply ingrained historical association between women, care work, and domestic labour that industries have like worked around and worked with, but those are complicated compromises, I suppose, that get made. So yeah, that's probably it.
Well, thank you, Amy. I'm sure, the listeners to the rest of the podcast will have enjoyed hearing, from you, this, the host, hearing a bit more about what you're doing. So thank you very much for sharing your research with us today.
Yeah, the hostess was the mostess, like any good Tupperware party, eh?
Thank you for joining us on Women's Business Voice, where women rise, lead, and make an impact. If you loved today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a woman who needs to hear this. Want more inspiration? Visit womensbusiness.club to connect, grow, and be seen. Until next time, keep showing up powerfully. The world needs what only you can bring.